All right. Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to the discussion for the YSI Financial Stability Group on Christine Desan's book, Making Money. We read the book over about 6 weeks, and Professor Christine Desan was, kind enough to join us for a discussion. Professor Desan is a professor at Harvard Law School, and has written this wonderful book that we spent time kind of digging into, and we're looking forward to discussion. So I think Professor Desan is going to make a few kind of initial comments. We sent some questions in advance, and then we'll have kind of a broader discussion. Yeah, so I'll hand the floor over. Thanks.
So first off, starting with thanks for taking the book really seriously, for engaging it. That's a real honor, and hearing who you all are is also an honor to be here, given your interests and your expertise. So it's really a delight. I thought what I'd do, I looked at the questions, and they fell into kind of three groups to me. So I thought what I would do is state the groups that I'm seeing, say a bit about the first, and then stop and we could discuss, and then I could say a bit about the second, and then I could say a bit about the third, and we could discuss in between. So the three themes that I saw were, I'll state the themes, and you can tell me if this sounds approximately like a good way to go forward. There were a set of questions that were really about the basic dynamics, what money is, how it comes about, how it works, why the stakeholder story, does money need to be public, those kinds of questions. And then there were a set of questions about history. Do we need history? How much variation is there across different designs in say, the ancient world or the modern world? And then there were some questions about the international architecture, right? Can we carry forward a constitutional approach into the international architecture and international terrain? So I would propose I talk a little bit about the first, about the basic dynamic, what money is, how I approach it, then we stop, discuss, then I could do more of the history. I imagine these things will seep into each other, but sound like a good way to go forward?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. So questions about the basic dynamic, about what money is. There was a question that really struck me. Why the stakeholder story? Why did I choose it? And I would say that the process of writing the book was very dialectic. That is, I was learning, trying to educate myself about money and looking at theories of money. And then I was looking to the real world, and I was going back and forth, right? And trying to fit them together. And the stakeholder story, in a way, it chose me, right? It was the story that emerged as I was trying to fit the basic processes together, to fit the theory together with what I saw happening as I was doing the history. So as I did that, and by the way, writing the book, for those of you who are in the throes of this, it was totally a voyage of discovery for me. Really, I came to this completely without preconceptions, and so it was a real adventure as well as labor. So I appreciate the points about the book. It did take it took about a decade, right? And it was a real labor of love and of work. Anyway, as I was kind of moving between the theory and the history that I was looking, base money, that is what we would think of today as high-powered money, appears again and again, or appeared again and again, as I eventually articulated it, to be a form of public credit, right? A form of public accounting that is then adjusted to create a medium for individuals as well. So the unit of account, which became for me kind of the center of money's definition, is established by public actors, or by actors working for a group. Public doesn't necessarily mean state in the formal sense, but by actors working for a group who advance credit to members, right, to certain individuals in exchange for value. So that's what I was seeing. And then as I'm sort of tracking that phenomenon, I was increasingly seeing that the unit of account could be replicated, and in fact is replicated for private use again and again, right? The basic unit of account is set at the center, and then that is replicated. And one of my endless kind of debates with Perry has been kind of, which comes first? How do we think about the public and the private? He's much more focused than I am, although I've become increasingly interested and respectful, right, of the private side of this, right, of private money, private credit creation, I would say, not unit of account creation, but credit creation. So just a word about sort of the roots of that. I really started this project. So I'm a lawyer. I'm interested in institutions and in the way they operate and in the way law operates. So I was looking at the constitutional crisis in early America and kind of the early United States, 1780s, 1790s. It turns out that whenever you get a public community organizing itself, a lot of its debates are about money, right? And that fit increasingly with my observation, and then, kind of conviction that what we're seeing is communities organizing themselves to be able to mobilize resources, right? It makes a huge amount of sense. So I'm trying to figure out 1780s, 90s. That took me backwards first to early America, and trying to figure out what happened in early America took me backward to England, because the Americans are getting a lot of their ideas and are also caught actually in an imperial vice that forces them to improvise in various ways. What the early Americans, so now we're talking colonists, 18th century pre-United States, did was create paper money, straight out, incredibly basic tax anticipation currency. And in many ways, that was a gift to me, because I could see without any interference what seemed to me to be the basic logic of the design, right? So two aspects of money, a tax anticipation credit that then circulates between individuals and is very very explicitly given the power to circulate between individuals. In addition, as you can see in the book, but only kind of if you're reading the footnotes kind of carefully, the other gift that early sort of 18th century drama gave to me is that it attracted a set of economists in the 1980s who were trying to figure out why paper money worked in the colonies. And they modeled paper money and then had an argument about their models. And I learned a tremendous amount from that set of arguments. So these are Bruce Smith, who died very young, was a student of Tom Sargent's, Charles Calamiris, Farley Grubb, who else? Scott Sumner, who has a blog today. So they created two theories and then argued about them: an asset pricing theory and a theory about supply. Sumner's theory was much. He emphatically insisted it was more conventional, fit within current norms about thinking about money as the medium. So just a word, but both of these theories, although I didn't articulate it as such at that point, are really reduced to credit theories, insofar as they're understanding and proposing accounts that identify the unit of account as something made, as an asset made out of a public commitment to advance value, right? So, a tax anticipation credit is a public commitment to advance value when the token is recognized as valuable for the payment of a tax. And that's basically the asset pricing theory, right? That you have an asset that has value for some future moment, has an utility for future, to pay off, extinguish a future obligation. And so the asset value, people were going that direction. Americans pretty much articulate paper money as that. I mean, they're saying this is a credit you can use to pay your taxes with. They're not theorizing it in fancy ways, but they are theorizing it. And Benjamin Franklin is one of the foremost theorists in really interesting ways. He's a printer, right, of paper money. The economists in this debate added the insight that the liquidity quality, the quality of money providing liquidity, transactional services added to its value. So, and they were working this out because they were thinking, why don't people discount a token if it's used, if they're anticipating its utility for to extinguish a future obligation. Why aren't they discounting it? And sometimes they are, but not where it's viable as a medium, because then they're getting liquidity services from the asset before its moment of extinction, if you will. Sumner's theory, what I call the sort of more conventional theory, I can't remember if he attached a title to it, but it's basically saying, the value of a medium exists according to the supply and demand for the medium. The government is controlling supply and to some extent demand. So people will attribute value to the medium insofar as they anticipate its rise and fall in value. But if you think about that, right, which I did as a lawyer, it's also kind of giving a contractual basis to it's in some ways acknowledging that demand depends on taxation or can be influenced by taxation, and the government makes a kind of contract with individuals to tax in what it issues. Okay, so bottom line, what was becoming, I think what was emerging from those models, and at least that kind of money, was that it was a public credit that was circulating. And that seems true over time about many of the forms we recognize as money. So in some ways, what I did in other places was look for the logic to see if it fit, or see how those other practices were adjusting my logic, right? It could be that not all monies are public credit, but it's certainly true that a lot of things we recognize as money are forms of public credit. So the public credit explanation explains a huge amount of monies. And again, just as a lawyer, it turns out this is statutorily clear in the case of modern monies. In the case of the United States dollar, it's an obligation of the United States recognized as good for payment for public payments. And it's also recognized in Supreme Court jurisprudence in ways the Supreme Court never theorized, but kind of fumbles its way to. So one of the things I want to write about in the future are these more strictly speaking legal approaches to value. So this is nothing new. This is not an invention of the 20th century, right? This is old stuff. These both 18th century American theories, 19th century Supreme Court jurisprudence, US statutes. So the state, just a last thing about this, kind of the stakeholder story came in thinking about why the public, why collectives were inventing this form, we're inventing an accounting medium and allowing it to circulate. That's really what it came down to. And in fact, inventing money enormously expands public capacity. So fiscal sociologists don't really study pre-monetary societies. There's a recent introduction to a fiscal sociology for those of you who are the tax route into studying money strikes me as fascinating. It is, the incredibly important source of demand, right, for a medium. A recent intro to a sociology volume indexes activities of the state to reliance on taxation in fungible resources, right, as opposed to conscripted service. That is to say, we're really talking monetary societies there. And an increase in monetary capacity correlates with modernization itself. So once you recognize that, I think, at least for me, I saw money in a new light, right? So virtually all economic, it's really astonishing, with the exception of, the central bankers here wouldn't have fallen victim to this, but economists assume that money is for private activity. Right? So it's for trade. Tobin identifies money as for trade, as if the collective infrastructure within which people operate and create order and produce and exchange doesn't matter, right? The collective infrastructure, security, i.e. defense, criminal law, civil dispute resolution, policing, public infrastructure, including transportation, education, public health, the enforcement of exchange, as if all that stuff comes for free. It doesn't come for free. Right? So enforcement of exchange, again, as a lawyer, we are always thinking about what makes something stick, what makes something enforceable, right? All of that, the whole matrix for individual exchange is a public phenomenon, and that is the reason that collectives are interested in money. In many ways, it's much harder for them to operate than it is for individuals to sneak by doing, sort of trying to get by. I'll just say, I think that wraps in a lot of the questions, and I'll stop there. I'll just say one thing to connect this project to Perry and his emphasis on hybridity, right? The public-private, the relationship of public-private. There's no reason to think that the money produced by public authorities and circulated by public authorities by a stakeholder, for example, bears any resemblance to the amount of money that people want to lubricate private exchange. Right? So that also became clear to me as I was studying money. The amount that the public produces, may not match what individuals produce when we, and I'm not here poking the old debate about, is there such a thing as monetary scarcity? Societies don't want to endure great deflationary or for that matter, inflationary periods. They need a medium that will lubricate the kind of productivity they are seeking to make. And so basically every society that I've looked at so far, may not be true across the board, comes up with some way to expand the public money, the unit of account, in ways that lubricate private activity and somehow tie that public base money to an expanded supply of money. So the medieval world, minting on demand, early America, land banks, right? So you had, you created a tax anticipation currency that would disappear when the defense need disappeared, or when the public need, it's a very thin state in these provinces. When that disappeared, so did the money. That was no good for people. So you see the colonists basically invent a supplemental kind of money that is a public land bank scheme, right? In which farmers mortgaged their land to get currency. The modern world commercial banks, of course. Okay, so I think it's a really rich connection, the connection between this work and Perry's work. I'll stop there and just see how that landed.
Great, thanks. I mean, I have a bunch of questions, but I see, I'm sure others do too. But I see Alex eagerly had his hand raised, so I'll let him go first.
Yeah. So money as a form of public credit. I think it's clear that monies are managed by the state, and the base money, of course, is managed by the state, issued by the state. So the question is, what is that evidence for? Is that evidence that money is fundamentally a public thing, or are the public institutions managing something in such a way that they're kind of subject to constraints of what the market needs, or something like that? Like can you imagine a scenario in which maybe the public is managing or is doing some kind of taxing or having a tax credit that is not usable really in practical terms for the private sector or something like that?
So what does it open up? I mean, I think it's a great question. I always think in some ways, the value of an explanation is what it allows us to see, right? So it's not a formalistic enterprise. And for me, I think the value of thinking of it as public credit is that it opens up a set of questions about, in some ways, exactly the direction you're going, right? How do societies create credit? How do they gain legitimacy? When might they lose legitimacy? I just wrote an article that's about kind of trying to think through really different pledges of value, ways to support the idea that money, the public credit. And that argument is saying, and this is implicit in the book too, or maybe explicit in ways, but we're all running around the circles in our own heads. Coin really carried its own collateral, right? This is a world in which it made sense to think of the coin as public credit but also carrying the collateral of the commodity value, of its commodity value coin by coin, right? And that is a very different theory than a world in which, so now we fast forward to the present, in which the government is issuing bonds, right? Issuing a long-term debt, taking the value of that long-term debt in money, basically the operation of say a direct issue relationship with a central bank, committing to pay back that bond to creditors holding the bond, right? If you think about that, that's also a security mechanism. That's a pledge that the creditors have an interest to enforce, that they will basically tax enough after spending to pay back the bond. And so I'm setting aside, I know it's not that linear. We have all sorts of questions about how much the government can spend in excess of borrowing, but it's a really interesting variation on the credit relationship. And it correlates, correlate is too weak a word, right? At the same time that we see the movement to banks of issue, right, to a national bank, to the Bank of England, we see this change, a really watershed change in legalities, in the legalities that attach to the public bond, and a rise in the rights of creditors who are holding bonds, right? An increase in the rights of those creditors against the public, against the sovereign. Okay, so all sorts of changes, it just opens us to think, to understand money as a complex political institution rather than black boxing it, and think about what rises or falls on all those changes in design. So for me, part of what was really interesting about the book was thinking about, the medieval world. The medieval world's economy is emphatically linked to the fact that it's run on a currency that carries its collateral in monetary form, that the British, for political reasons, are not willing to debase, so that the monetary form becomes superficial. They're not willing to play with it that way, so it's meaningful for them. And that's a really different, that's a different political economy than the one that's built on bonds, on circulating public bonds. You went a slightly different direction in the end of your question. Can you remind me what? I'm not sure that I'm going straight to the end of your question.
I don't remember what I said at the end of my question, but just to kind of follow up, if I'm the private market economy and I need a pricing and payment standard, we can ask the question of, well, who's in the best position to provide that and manage that for me? And the answer is probably going to be public institutions, right? Mm-hmm. So thinking at it from that perspective, can we define and specify money based on what the private sector needs? And then kind of following from that, the government institutions are then forced to meet that specification? Or does it kind of go in another direction?
I see. Sort of the chicken and egg in some ways question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think, so let me go to what seemed to me eventually the most primal part about the unit of account. So first of all, I think you have a real circularity problem, right? If in your story, because you can't get the kind of robust economy that you're imagining without a state, without some kind of public coordination from the beginning. I mean, you can just describe the public as just a coordinating mechanism. That's okay with me, right? But I'll just flag sort of the amount of effort to think of money as a private activity, as opposed to think of it as publicly originated, is itself really interesting. I mean, the amount of effort we see in the literature, it's part of classical liberalism, right? It's part of the modern mindset, which accompanied the development of modern money. And part of the effort in the kind of in that Enlightenment moment is to move authority away from the state, right? To think about ways to decentralize that authority. But what I was going to say, in many ways, your question takes me to what I see as the sort of most emphatically public part of the unit of account. And that is that I am completely unconvinced that, or I'll try to convince you to put it more aggressively, that there's no way to get commensurability without a unit of account. So there's a catch-22 that's not just, how robust can private exchange become without a state? It's really, we don't have commensurability at all in value unless we have some way to create the unit of account. And so it's not at all like a weight or a measure, money. There is no pre-existing linearity or pre-existing mass that is measured by money. That value is too incommensurable. You know, it's dogs and military service. It's, you know, healthcare and oranges. I mean, there's no way to commensurate all these things. So one of the projects I did after the book was look at economic models of the unit of account. And if you think through, you know, this is really your field more than mine. General equilibrium theory, the Walrasian auction, assumes a unit of account, right? Imputes a unit of account, which is a sister commodity, right? That will have, that has, and in which there's no value attributed to its also being a medium, right? We just assume a medium of a unit of account, and then we have the auction. That is completely inconsistent with the barter stories that say, we have trade and it produces a unit of account. It produces a money. I think the general equilibrium story is the correct one in the sense that it acknowledges that it's necessary to set a unit of account in order to understand and make commensurable value. So I think it's some really, you know, kind of, how do we call this, sort of metaphysical level. What's happening is that a collective is creating a unit that has a material, that creates a reference point of material value, which is, you know, a quota that you owe to this collective. And then is, and then, you know, different societies price different things, and you know, there are different legal regimes. You couldn't sell land in England. You could sell people, right? I mean, there are whole different legalities about what can be priced and what can't. But as societies work that out and allow exchange and enforce exchange in a unit, that's how we get prices. So I think the whole, you know, if you push me to say, where's the beginning of the chicken and the egg? I think the beginning is in that collective moment of defining a unit of account, which defines commensurability. And I think, you know, when I sort of unpacked the slippage between kind of general equilibrium theory and other theories of money, macroeconomic theories of money, or wherever they live in the economic discipline, and barter theories, it's as if there's kind of there's a disconnect, right? A disjunction between those theories, in which the barter theories become just the throwaway, right? They're just the popular layman, you know, we'll tell the general public it's barter, but our models actually don't theorize it as barter and don't depend on that. And barter really is, you know, inconsistent with the idea that you need a unit of account to start the moment of exchange to allow valuation itself, right? I mean, and part of what's so interesting about general equilibrium theory is the moment of valuation itself that matters, right? It's that moment that's the moment of economic importance, not so much exchange. Exchange is just carrying out what happens. Whereas in barter, exchange does all the work, right? We've now kind of moved to Adam Smith, and I do think that story does a lot of work in terms of entrenching our intuitions that markets are natural. Therefore, comparisons in value are natural. They happen organically. We don't have to think about how they happen. But in fact, they don't happen organically. They happen because you've created a unit in which you're measuring stuff.
That's great, thanks. That's actually very related to the question that, well, the first question I was going to ask, which was kind of focused on this unit of account question. And so I think maybe to kind of not be too redundant and kind of like connect it to some of the other stuff in the book. I mean, in the beginning, there are in the kind of first section of the book, you have these origin stories, right? And you're comparing the origin story of the kind of conventional economics. And I see Larissa here in the chat mentions this kind of like the coincidence of wants story. And I think, one of the things that I found kind of useful or interesting in kind of focusing on, say, the unit of account, or, the way in which you kind of critique or pick apart this story a bit is that, and it comes up also later, the use of kind of credit as payment in kind of exchange, it seems to be very useful in these kind of bilateral exchanges. But as soon as we want something that's kind of, kind of multilateral, something that, is not just, payments between you and me, but can be transferred to a third party, it gets much harder to kind of get there from the conventional story, right? And I guess I remember also in the book, you discuss a bit the way in which this is kind of slowly kind of constructed over time, requirements for farmers to pay in coins, or requiring exchanges to happen in towns under the observation of authorities, or I particularly liked, I guess it's more kind of an allegory, or like I don't know the right word for it, another story, but like an alternative story about kind of the wandering king who's expecting different kinds of tribute, right? And may require all kinds of resources for various purposes, but for this reason, is not just a butcher looking for a shoemaker who doesn't want meat and wants some third thing, and there's a place in which a unit of account can be established somewhat arbitrarily via the like preferences or needs of a kind of middle a stakeholder, or someone with a kind of central location in the kind of economy that kind of relates to many different markets rather than just several bilateral exchanges. So I guess I was wondering if maybe you could talk just a little bit more about this kind of, your kind of vision of the kind of creation stories versus the ones in the kind of conventional story. And I guess also a bit how this relates to the cash premium part of it, because that's what I kind of have in mind about, us being able to do bilateral payments through credit relatively easily in these kind of recurring relationships where, I buy you a beer at the pub and you buy me one the next day, and we can kind of forever be in debt trusting each other, but we can't take those to third parties. And this cash premium comes out of this, unit of account, this kind of more multilateral aspect of the stakeholder story. Anyways, it's not like a specific question, but kind of, I was interested in this aspect of the early part of the book.
So there's a lot packed in there. Let me just say a couple things that occur to me in response. I mean, one of the recurring themes in the history that became true to me in the history that I was seeing in history is the importance of sovereign political power and competition for sovereign political power, and the way it's acted out monetarily. In some ways, this is probably less evident in this book than it would have been if I'd been writing about the continent, right? Because England becomes centralized comes under centralized rule fairly quickly, and part of that, my guess is, my strong sense is, more than a guess, is that has to do with the monetary system, right? They're working out a strong, as centralized as the common law is the English monetary system. But having said that, you can see sovereigns, certainly in the early period that you're talking about, 7th, 8th century, it seemed to me, it's really hard to have a clincher in the history. We don't know a lot about the history. So I wasn't trying to write that as saying the only way to interpret this is that we have competing stakeholders, but it certainly seemed to me that an obvious way to interpret it was that we had competing stakeholders. It's certainly true to say that that political authority was growing up with the market, and that where we saw political authority becoming stronger, we see the market, we see political economic productivity increasing. And you also see competition between sovereigns. Here, just to fast forward, right, again and again, World War I, right, the Civil War. I mean, one conflict after another becomes a monetary conflict. And this reminds me actually of Alex's question. There's a book, which I haven't read for years, but I remember as being really interesting, by a guy named David Woodruff called Money Unmade that was about the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And he's tracing the breakdown of the Soviet Union, as I remember it, through the breakdown of the ruble, right? Understanding that as authorities lost control of a strong medium and could no longer, I mean, you know, you could tell Zimbabwe's history, you could tell a number of countries' history this way, but he sort of maps that out. So he's very much kind of showing how political dynamics and monetary dynamics are intertwined. So that's kind of one obvious thing that your question makes me think of. In terms of the cash premium, I think you are absolutely right. It's another kind of slippage in the way that we've become used to thinking about money is that it's the same thing to have reciprocal trade among familiars as to have trade between strangers, right? So we again and again tend to generalize things that could happen between medieval merchants. Okay, that gets generalized and becomes banking. But not so, right? Those were very carefully contrived reciprocal circuits. Going retail is a whole different question, right? Going retail so that you can have money passing between strangers. You know, a whole country is not a reciprocal set of familiars. A nation is not that scale, right? It's the scale of strangers. And that moment of going retail requires a story, right? Requires an account. And we can't just say it's, you know, reciprocal circuits of between bilateral, you know, and bipolar relations going somehow magnified. So the third thing, so yeah, I think that's really important. And I think that's when you get a third party, right? That it's that moment that money is a retail medium. It's not just familiar. It's not the private credit amplified somehow. So this actually, in a quirky way, makes me think of Bob's question sent to me by Alex about banks and banks of issue. And I'll see if I can tie this in, because it was a really interesting question about, you know, the beginning of banks of issue. And one of the things I'm working on now is thinking about banks of issue and how they compare with medieval banks. So there are a set, so as you probably know, especially those of you who are bankers or work on banks, the standard story is we have medieval banks, experts in credit creation, and they somehow become modern banks, right? They morph into modern banks. And Bob's was going at that, if I understood your question, Bob, correctly, was going at that question. And I don't think I think that we are right to question that trajectory. I don't think, and when you look carefully, right, at the banking scholars, the people who really had their finger on how it works, so Raymond de Roover, who's a medievalist, Badgett, for that matter, right? They tell a different story. So the story that I'm seeing is the first sustained bank of issue at the national level is the Bank of England. You know, some people say Sweden, okay, maybe Sweden for 5 years, but the Bank of England, right, is a bank of issue, not a regular bank in the sense that it's a bank of issue from the beginning. And the reason it survives as a bank of issue, producing its promises in return for a long-term obligation by the government. It's not somehow in a reciprocal relationship where they're giving and taking silver coin. It's producing paper promises in, you know, against a long-term bond, basically. That only really works because it's the government that's the counterparty, right? The government is incredibly secure. Of course, it could fail. It could, you know, the regime could fall apart, the government could fail, and thus so would the Bank of England, but it's much better than any other private party, as we saw in the financial crisis, right? The government is the best counterparty. So a viable government. So that first bank of issue, the way that I see it, and when I look at banking histories, here's the story I'm seeing. That bank of issue is revolutionary because it breaks open. This kind of takes us to the historical questions, right? Why did I focus on that moment? That was the moment that was just revolutionary. It's breaking out of the medieval strictures that attach to a money that carries its own collateral, as well as making money on a whole new theory, which is to involve investors in making money and to issue them against this long-term bond, including passing on seniorage, as Bob points out in his in his question. So what happens is we get that revolution. That's a bank of issue that has the government as a counterparty. If you look at like Temin and Voth, scholars about goldsmith banking in the early 18th century, those banks, which were based on a more medieval model, fall apart. They fail. They're not viable. They can't compete as note issuers with the Bank of England, and they were never very robust note issuers anyway, because they're operating within the bilateral, right? This limited circle of credit. It's the end of the 18th century, or the middle and end of the 18th century, when we see new banks, country banks, and here it's Presnell's work that I think is really interesting, that pop up. And those are banks, new kind of banks of issue, in the sense that they're actually not circulating savings. They're creating money substitutes, their own credit, to run their own businesses, their industries. So here we're thinking retail here. It's not that they're making exchanges with other merchants. They are things like textile manufacturers who need to pay their workers, and they pay in promises to pay. They take back promises to pay Bank of England and sterling coin, right? Promises to pay the national unit of account. But a lot of those promises to pay are canceled in the local economy as that money comes back to them, because everybody is paying rent to those big families. Or, we could, and Adam Smith and the stuff on Scottish banking, their stories, we can tell about big textile manufacturer paying workers, workers paying farmers, on whose land they live, those farmers paying shopkeepers, shopkeepers returning the notes to the big families. And second step here, that stuff, which is now becoming retail, is linked into the national payment system, because we now have a national payment system, right? We have the Bank of England, we have inland bills of exchange, we have a set of institutions that didn't previously hook up money substitutes with the national unit of account, with coin as effectively. So I'm really seeing this as an answer to Bob's question, but I think the question really is also focusing on that movement, but the difference between a bilateral or bipolar kind of credit to one that is retail. And it's that retail level requires a linchpin, a third party, right? A public authority, or in the case of the British, for viability, the way this system gets tied in, we can talk about how if you're interested, but gets tied into London, right? Gets tied into the national payment structure. And then you really have commercial banks working at the retail level in the provinces, tied into the national, tied into London, to the Bank of England. It's a really fascinating story.
Yeah, could I ask just a quick follow-up kind of related to that, which is, it's during this kind of time and the section of the book that you could have talked about the beginning of fractional reserve banking, or the way in which the growth of the country banks and the kind of banking sector in general started leading to kind of net settlement, which really meant that you didn't need to have kind of all of the you didn't need to necessarily be sending all of your kind of money anytime you were making a payment from one bank to another. So you didn't have to have kind of fully reserved full reserves for your notes or deposits. I guess the notes are kind of a bit more of what's interesting, but could you elaborate a little bit more on is it, was it just is not the right word, but was it primarily the growth of the banking sector that kind of led to this? Was it, just that as there were all of a sudden, more and more country banks and more interbank payments, it became more and more easier and easier to kind of net payments and use a more kind of fractional reserve type system, as opposed to the kind of earlier goldsmith banks that would give you a note tied kind of directly to gold and this kind of thing. Do you have a sense of kind of what in this time really led to this shift?
So I certainly, when I wrote the book, I was just feeling my way in the period that you're talking about, right? Was the period I knew the least about, sort of the 19th century. those decades, and I was really just suggesting what I could see. And so this is is one of the things I'd like to work on now. So in many ways, I'm saying I don't think I can answer your question now, but I can say this. I think, I mean, from reading Fractional, right, and banking historians who were interested, right? So one of, for me, the most fruitful things is reading historians who for some reason are really fascinated by an institution. He actually wasn't asking this question that you're asking or that I'm asking. What made these banks retail? He wasn't there, right? He was asking more, I guess he was just interested in the development of, regional economies. Anyway, it seemed to me that what was going on is a story about monetary scarcity, into which is again and again true, right, in these economic questions. The provinces are starved of money. Bank of England is very cautious in terms of how much money it issues over the course of the 18th century. The British have in various ways screwed up their coined money supply, which has always been inadequate. So it is no longer adequate for low-level exchange. Silver coin, as you might know, has gone out of circulation completely. So they're playing with different money substitutes. So I think it's monetary scarcity that really happens first, and then they have these various large industrialists creating this. Here I'm just studying. I don't think this was much in. I had read Fractional somewhat, but I hadn't really digested him when I wrote the book, right? So now I'm much more interested in the fact that it is these big industrial families who are issuing money for their own use, right? They're not lending. They are de facto lending because they're spending their credit, but they're issuing money for their own use in order to create, in order to run their businesses. And it is true that they begin to reciprocate across each other. The families reciprocate their promises. But probably at least as important, and here's a place where I really feel like I don't know how to answer your question, at least as important is the ability to settle things and run things through London, right? So tax collectors start taking local money in part because they can return notes to a big player in the provinces who will write them a bill of exchange on London, where the big player has sold its goods and has Bank of England notes, right? Has sold its products for the national currency. So so in ways that I just couldn't map yet, but find really intriguing, we get the instruments to allow eventually clearing and set-offs, in part because it's not a strictly parochial provincial story. It's a story that's actually very tightly integrated into London as the center of that activity. So somehow that's, the other piece of this, just to throw it out there for those of you for whom this might ring bells or catalyze some creative thought. The other thing that we know, at least I think this is true, it's all like on my agenda for more research, is that a lot of these industrial players, they're not acting on the basis of accumulated capital, and they're not borrowing from banks accumulated capital, right? There's something else going on. So while Badgett, for example, is completely inconsistent, sometimes telling a story of banks of issue, and sometimes telling a story about savings coming from the south to the north, right? Sometimes he's telling that story. It really looks like that's going on, but that might be as much a story about London and the integration into London as a center. It really looks like it's money creation that is driving the Industrial Revolution, or that is allowing and facilitating that kind of productivity.
Great, thanks. So I just want to check. We were kind of originally billed for an hour, but we often go a bit longer. But I want to be mindful of your time. Do you have a little more time to discuss?
Yeah, that's fine. Mm-hmm.
Great. So I just want to make one kind of follow-up comment, which is just not a question, but just as you were talking, kind of made me think a little bit. And then I want to see if there are other kind of questions, and I know that you also had a couple of the themes that you want to discuss. But just a thought on kind of what you were saying a moment ago and relating it to something that we're kind of talking about earlier. I mean, when we're talking about money within familiars, there's a sense in which, I don't know about unlimited, but there's relative ease in creating money. You know, again, we can exchange, you know, beers every other day in the pub or something. And as long as, you know, we're colleagues or friends or whatever, that's relatively straightforward. But once we start talking about the whole economy and trying to like transfer thing, you know, being able to use these IOUs as payments to third parties, it becomes difficult because we're not necessarily familiars. But then the story that you kind of were giving here, and you talk a little bit about in the book, and I think in some ways is also related to a lot of kind of Perry Maryland stuff in his course about the use of the kind of like reserve banks in the major cities in the US, is that there's within the banks, because it's kind of a smaller network, they're kind of more familiars, right? And so in some sense, the banks are, you know, able to do more of the kind of money creation or, you know, paying through IOUs within their economy, because there's, you know, within their kind of strata of the economy, because there's kind of more, yeah, there's less heterogeneity, they're more familiars, and so they can kind of do it within themselves. And so they act as, you know, perhaps some kind of in between, where at the, you know, at the retail level, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity and these like relationships that aren't always overlapping. Then at the bank level, they're more overlapping. It's easier to kind of do the money creation process because there are, you know, fewer players and more familiars as a proportion. And then once you get to the sovereign level, there's really kind of only one. But anyways, this was just like a kind of a thought kind of developed from what we were just talking about.
But can I just say in response, just real quickly on that, Bray Hammond, This Old History of the United States, is really interesting on that score. You can read a bunch of it as, you know, localities experimenting about how to manage those kind of relationships that you're talking about. And part of that is interesting about that book, if again, sort of, he doesn't always ask this question, but I find it fascinating. You know, it turns out there's another government besides the federal government, and that is the state governments. And they are acting they're influencing money creation, even though they can't create the dollar, right? That's federal under the US Constitution. They can influence local state circulation of the dollar through their own taxing authority. So there's some story we haven't even cracked the surface of there. We haven't even begun to ask the kind of questions that we should be asking in terms of understanding what was going on there and what could probably still go on at the state level.
Thanks. Jay?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really enjoying where the conversation currently is, because I was listening to the circuit story you were telling earlier, and I'm of course coming from the Perry Maryland view and the hybridity story and his emphasis on dealers and market makers, and of course that is much more taken up by a private institutional setup in most cases, but in crisis, these sort of market maker or dealer of last resorts are public institutions, as we've seen in the crises. So I was just trying to see if this intuition actually links up in the way that we're seeing, because generalizing money or generalizing exchange is a liquidity story, as Perry would say, and sort of universalizing and finding different circuits in which these different IOUs and in different hierarchy, the hierarchy of money is also something Perry emphasizes, is a story of different circuits and different familiars linking up to each other. And the story that I was sort of, the question that I was sort of striking to me, I didn't see in the book, but as we were reading the book, didn't come up in our discussions, but now as we're talking, Christine, was that there's a pull, right? There is both a public utility function that's done by some sort of bank or dealer or somebody that's making the system go, but there's a power that's associated with that. You know, you're making liquidity is not free. You have to provide it. You have to somehow make it go. So that's counter to the conventional economic story. But also there's a power associated with that. There's always the sort of inherent story that you're also saying, like there's an expansionary story to how far can you take this, and that's an exploratory process. You don't know what the limits are that are workable. But then there's also push-pull, because once one player concentrates that power too much, then there will be a pushback by the other players. If it's private, then the government will sort of say, I would like to have it more in my circuits and have more control of it potentially, or it would be the private sector will do that too. So I'm just wondering if that sort of both sort of the actual the functional aspect of the need for such circuits and managing the circuits is there, and also at the same time, you know, the pull in different directions is also there, and there's a power element that we're also not fully discounting, at least in Perry's story. This power element, or the sort of this design element, it's much more sort of, it happens as it goes. You know, we sort of designed also the Minsky story that we've been in another book. We're sort of saying the private sector is always innovating and always trying to find new ways to expand the money supply on scarce resources, and the government is then blessing it or not blessing it, depending on how it manages the crisis that's emerging. That's what we got from some of the readings we did on Minsky, at least. So I'm just wondering if this is actually true or does this resonate with you? Because I'm trying to, for me it's not a metaphysical story to sort of say how does value or this unit account get you know, it's not a metaphysical story about the market or the government. It's an actual in practice process that's actively managed by somebody every day. And actually, that's where Perry actually puts his finger on with the liquidity story and the market makers and the dealers. But he doesn't have a story about a lot of other things you're bringing into the picture as well. I'm just wondering if that resonates.
Yeah, I totally agree. The way you put it, right? It's not a metaphysical story. It's a story about the practice of every day. I completely agree with. And in some ways, it anticipates what I was going to say about, do we need the history? Well, yes and no, right? I think you can tell. So I think that I can tell the story of money as credit without the history, right? Saying it's credit because it is a promise to advance value on demand. That's what the dollar is. The US says it will advance value on demand, material value on demand, and it does so when it takes your dollar for material recompense, right? Having said that, the abstract story doesn't take us that far, right? I mean, in some ways it's interesting, right? It's interesting to try to theorize it. And this is where, for me, it's a dialogue, you know, I'm sort of going back and forth. But, you know, you can say governance is an abstract story too. We should all have democracies. Well, okay, we should all have democracies. The whole devil is in the details, right? Everything is, you know, everything becomes situated when we think, okay, so how do we create credit, right? Who is getting spent to and who's getting taxed? And what kind of assets can circulate, right? That's, you know, so to respond to Jay, kind of, you know, as I hear your question, here's what I hear. Here's what's not in the book at all, but which became really important to me in the years after the book, and is really in my classes. As I taught this stuff, I realized, you know, just talking about liquidity and talking about the moment where they really revolutionize the issue of money creation, that's only the beginning of the story, right? What happens after, you know, 1690 is that we get, so here are the institutions that Perry picks up, right? Bonds, circulating bonds that can move hand to hand, easily transferable. That's not medieval. That's an innovation of Restoration, England, 1660s, 1670s. In many ways, it's catalytic to the Bank of England. Right? So they create bonds at the same moment, circulating public bonds, as they create the issue, you know, money atomized against bonds. It's amazing. And in the decades after that, they create capital markets. So capital markets aren't obvious. They're not organic. They're not institutionally a spontaneous efflorescence of private activity. No, they're a government creation out of the South Sea bubble. Right? So here's Larry Neal's work. So capital markets are a public innovation anchored, according to many people, maybe Perry too, by government debt, right? So if you think about the safe asset debates of the last decade, it's government debt that anchors capital markets. Capital markets dealers, all the market making that goes on in them, don't exist before the 1720s and 30s, not in any robust way. So Anne Murphy's work is about showing us how ineffectual the stock trading of the early 18th century is, right? It's 2 decades in after the South Sea bubble. This is Larry Neal tells a story about that as the Big Bang, right? The moment where the government steps in, pledges to pay back, right? Restructures its public debt into a credible form. So Northern Wine Gas too early, right? They don't have the story quite right. It's 2 decades after that when we get more credible public debt. And part of the reason, I mean, one of the most mind-blowing things for me, right, is part of the reason we get credible public debt after the 1720s and 30s is because we've created a national bank of issue that can always pay off that debt. So there's a much more interesting story here, right, about public and private working together than some idea in which the private's inventing everything and the public's stepping back and saying, okay, this I bless, that I don't. No, you know, it's not, this is, and Larry Neal is probably the most conventional kind of, you know, economic historian, true believer in classical, classical thought, that one can think of. And that's the story he's telling. And so that's the story of the beginning of capital markets. After that, you get retail banks, who are then going to connect to the capital markets in all the complex ways of the 20th century, the 19th and 20th centuries, right? Call loan markets, growth of the stock exchange, the bond market. So when, you know, it's in my teaching, I mean, you're absolutely right. I didn't get there in the book. I could, you know, I barely knew Perry, right? Who's taught me a lot since then, you know, reading him and having debates with him. Basically, it's, you know, not just, so say we have modern money issues. Capitalism for me is this set of things, right? It's modern money issue based on, you know, on a profit motive, right? Centralizing that profit motive as the correct compass for economic productivity, right? That we identify those things in the Bank of England, later in the commercial banks. So it's national banks, it's circulating public debt, not an asset we can just take for granted, but something that it has a moment of origin in the late 17th, early 18th century. Then capital markets, stable capital markets, and then retail banking. Those four institutions work together to create the juggernaut that is the modern economy. And it's those institutions that are going viral, right? It's a really specific set of institutions. If you allow me to share my screen, I don't know if I can do it, but I have
Sure, yeah.
I have a map of central bank. So this is just in some ways we've done the historical question, right? In answer to Jay's query, right? Yeah, I think we're on the same page in terms of the need to look at institutional detail and then the kind of amazing changes and redesigns you can see if you look at that detail. So, you know, that takes us to the international. It's those institutions, it's central banks and, you know, retail banking and capital markets and circulating bonds. Those are the things that go global. It's not some amorphous idea of the market spreading across the globe. So if I can share my screen, let's see if I can just do it.
Are you able to now? I think I did it.
Okay. So let me just see if I can play this, if I can get this to play. Can you see this?
Yep.
So this is this map that I did to, this is how central banks start, right? And if you look at the years, so this is, you know, this is the spread of these institutions concentrated in the spread of central banks. So if you look at the year at the top, it's moving. And this is just a map that I use when I teach a course that's about the construction of the international monetary system. And, you know, this is the development that we're seeing, right? It's a spread, it's associated with contagion and influence and imperialism. And, you know, that's the spread that we trace in that class, right? So it's a really interesting map. If you think about it, you see the, should I play it again? It's just so fun. Anyway, let's see if it works again. You can just see, you know, you see the takeoff, the contagion in Europe. And then, you know, you can trace each of those contagions either through, you know, sovereign borrowing and lending. And then, you know, the gold standard is a mechanism for disciplining banks of issue. That's what the gold standard is, not gold washing back and forth. And so you can see through, you know, you can see the spread of the gold standard and its identification with, you know, proper economic thought. Anyway, that's a whole nother story, but we could go into it if you're interested. Okay, I'll stop.
Great, thanks. Larissa, if I remember from some of the questions that we sent, you had a couple that were a little more like forward-looking, kind of, if I recall. Do you kind of want to remind us of those real quick? Because I think that's kind of a nice place to go next.
Yeah, I was just interested in how you think about or theorize the current attempts to change or restructure some of those institutions. So there are people within the private sector trying to invent their alternative parallel sets of currencies through crypto. Then there are central banks themselves looking to create central bank digital currencies, which can change the relationship around who can be a retail bank, and the relationship between retail and wholesale banking. So just be interested in your thoughts.
So I think it's really fertile territory for thinking about what money is and how it's spreading. And I am very much an amateur looking at that territory because I have not made the investment I think I would need to make, both into the technologies that are happening and into the variety of alternatives that are out there, right? So with that caveat, I would say the cryptocurrency space I think is really interesting. I have not seen it as money. So I'm on the side of, sort of the FT saying, sure looks like an asset to me, in which people are speculating. Having said that, and I'm still there, I think it's really interesting in part because of the way, for two reasons, right? One is sovereignties are up for grabs. So one way so the American colonies, actually to go back to them just for a moment, they invent these paper currencies that the British authorities do not take seriously until the 1760s. So they literally invent paper money. They have their own, Massachusetts, own Rhode Island, and they invent their own treasurers to hold that money. And they basically invent parallel economies to the British imperial economy. The governors are still trying to tax and spend in silver coin, which is non-existent. The provincial assemblies create these parallel economies and create national identity, provincial state identities out of those currencies. So for me, actually, American independence is a revolution. When the British try to take back the power to tax, remember that stuff about no taxation without representation? It's not some abstract principle. That's how they're running their economies with paper money. So it's really striking to connect this to Bitcoin. It does seem to me, and cryptocurrencies, it does seem to me that first of all, there's nothing formal about a state. You could have Facebook, you could have an organization so powerful that it creates a centralized unit that works within that ecosystem. It's a long way from there to being a state, right? Because you need law enforcement and you need to actually face an incredible number of questions that we leave aside when we're not thinking like a state. Right? I mean, law enforcement, law dispute resolution, the entire edifice, like my entire discipline has to pops up and becomes a challenge for anyone who's trying to act like a state. It's a huge challenge, but it's happened before that worlds got remade on the basis of a new money. So, and I think it's much more likely that something hybrid, to use it in a different way, would happen, like, El Salvador's president saying, we'll accept Bitcoin, or whatever it is, the governor in New Mexico, whoever, I mean, I think political authorities playing with cryptocurrency, I think that it's nuts for them to do so. And I think it could be very important, right? So you don't see I think the US, I think the Treasury Department, there's a moment of reckoning that's going to come, right? As each sovereign figures out, and you already see it happening, right? You see decreasing accommodation of the crypto space in some ways. You saw it with Libra for sure, when it looked like it could be a powerful enough countermeasure to actually at least disrupt sovereign currency. Anyway, so it's in some ways a battle over the definition of sovereignty to me. As far as central bank digital currencies, I think it's really fascinating. Clearly, we're going to go that way. The recent, I think, so Bob could confirm this or not, the recent Bank of International Settlements word on this was that they're not going to move in any way that displaces the commercial bank role, which I personally think is sort of disappointing, but you can understand why, right? I mean, I'm interested in displacing the commercial bank role, rethinking why banks have that kind of power, commercial banks, given that they sort of happen into it as issuers of money substitutes as opposed to experts in credit. Having said that, you can see in that if that ceiling, if that becomes a limitation, then I think it's a change in technology that's more like the movement from notes to deposits. Could be a really important change, and that kind of qualitative, where technological change could become important enough to be qualitatively significant. But if there's an attempt not to displace retail banking, then I think that's what it will amount to. It may be much more inclusive, radically inclusive, but include people in an existing ecosystem. Then there are a whole bunch of variations on that I'm really not an expert but Fed accounts I think is both more inclusive, but also still accepting the basic structure of central banking and finding a role for the commercial banks. Anyway, it would be a case by case, really interesting exercise to think, and I think it's what we need to do, right? To think through and understand what these design changes are with a long view about what the design changes have been and what turns on our restructuring and revision of them.
Like you said, it's very much a time of ferment where there's lots of kind of like money is, in the news and, kind of very big ways, and people are thinking about, new and very different kind of ways of designing and organizing things. Oliver, you want to go?
Yeah, I love this conversation, and thank you very much, Christine, for giving all of these answers and making us think. I have two questions related to, I'll call it politics of trustworthiness. I think one of them is very much about today. There is a lot of debates, especially between the US and China. Currently, the European Union is also playing into it, but and also about the question of debasement. And I'm wondering, to what degree do you maybe also hear kind of similarities or rhymes to past debates about debasements playing into the way it is talked about today between currencies and different groups? I always find it interesting to try and listen to in what ways debates kind of recapture things from history instead of trying to look at kind of as a lens with which to look at what is happening currently. And that's one. And the other thing is more going back into history itself, but also maybe with kind of looking forward to now. From what I've learned, debt can play two roles in which, on the one hand, having debt can actually give me status, but it can also reduce my status, and also for both sides of this part. And I'm wondering to what degree you see that playing out in banking as well, but also in the creation of money, the way in which money works. So one example I think of for today is, for example, the way in which Trump was able to, at least it seems to me, partially because he had so much debt, he was able to be seen as trustworthy. I'm speaking before he was president, and to be seen as kind of trustworthy in dealings with other banks and so on, because he already had so much debt. And so that already gives, and even though he might have been broke, at the same time, he was able to say, look at me, I'm such an important player. In some way, this might itself have been able to keep me afloat. And I'm wondering in what ways is that coming up? And I'm wondering whether there is maybe in this a connection to the feudal order that was or whether this worked in a similar way. And I'm wondering what you might have to say about this, and whether you see this connecting to questions of what Larissa in her comment pointed out about the network that is the monetary system. In what ways maybe you see development of monetary institutions and debates over who belongs in this group, in this union, and to what degree maybe, whether you see what kind of connection you see of politics of belonging and monetary institutions.
So there so yet again, there's so much in each of the questions that you're asking that I'm kind of floored for how to go about. And so I will preface this by saying I'm looking forward to talking with you individually, you know, as you do your work and on topics that you're interested in that connect with the stuff I'm doing. It would be just a pleasure. So let me just pick up a few things about from what you said. The relationships of debt, you know, so all know this famous thing of Keynes or whoever, you know, it's attributed to different people. If you owe a bank $1, you have a problem. If you owe the bank $1 million, it has a problem, right? I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot to that. And in many ways, the modern structure of money creation rides on a particular relationship between the government and creditors that was not true in the medieval world, which is not to say the medieval world didn't have its own hierarchies, but I think that the hierarchy around bondholders and the fetishization of austerity because of the power of bondholders is a particularly modern characteristic. It turns out, if you know, someplace in the book, I go into this a little bit, but, you know, it turned out that the British should have debased much more than they did. Part of the reason they didn't was a power struggle between Crown and Parliament. The Italian city-states debased much more. It was good for everybody. It was good for business. It doesn't mean that the wealthy didn't they tried to use a different unit of account, a gold unit of account, so they could avoid depreciation. But so it's true that depreciation everywhere you know, hurts creditors, but the modern system sanctifies the bondholder in a way that just wasn't true before because of the role that bonds play in our system. And the person who leaps to my mind, and maybe some of you who have studied this, is Alexander Hamilton, right? So Hamilton's whole pitch was, we need to ally the wealthy, the bondholders, with the government in order to get their buy-in politically, as well as their material well-being and wealth. And so he both, there are these series, so in many ways, my project actually began there, trying to understand Hamilton's logic. You're going straight to it, right, in the early world. And he both killed a policy debate that recommended, and Madison was on the other side, recommended distributing the costs of the Revolutionary War debt in ways that saved more of the, that returned more value to the first holders of government debt, who were the soldiers. And Hamilton's position was, no, we can't return more value to the holders. They sold, that was their choice. We have to pay full value to the secondary holders, who were speculators in public debt. And that was basically sanctifying the current bondholders, was his project. He also argued in favor successfully of the federal government assuming the states' debts. So the states had all accumulated their own debts in their own currencies during the Revolutionary War. Hamilton makes sure that they are assumed by the federal government, which increases the federal government's political power and appeal. So lots there. I think it's characteristically, or at least that we'd have to break it down as implicit in what I'm saying and think about the credit relations. Again, this goes back to one of the early questions about what difference does it make if we think of money as public credit. We have to think about, you know, how it's public credit, how it's secured, which is against bonds, what difference that makes. That builds a different relationship, a different political hierarchy. So it's not just a hierarchy of monies, right? It's a, you know, it's really constitutional, small c. So for me, it's all about governance and different political alliances and interests working in ways that create a political economy, right? In this case, are reinforcing or supporting value in, you know, along particular structures, and in particular, a structure that prioritizes the payment of bondholders. That's just essential. So maybe I can follow that just briefly to your first question about debasement. I'm totally fascinated, as you are, by the commonalities between periods. And you know, we see recurring themes. Having said that, the circumstances and situations of devaluation, for example, are a product of these institutional architectures that change over time. So today's today's kind of face-off between the US and China, the US as a reserve currency, the Chinese government holding all these securities. This is a function, and in this, the course that I teach that's about the legal architecture of globalization, in which I'd love any of you, if you ever want to take a course or audit, to have you in conversation with students in that course and with me would be great. But we really look at the progress of the way sovereign debt becomes an important modern security and crosses bounds, and the way pegged and unpegged currencies, reserve and non-reserve currency, the way countries are interacting in the post-Bretton Woods period, what their opportunities are, how they try to defend their currencies by borrowing, what causes balance of payments crises. And then think about the way those crises almost always end in devaluation. Right? So we're trying to map those episodes of devaluation within a geography that is specific to the patterns of economic development we see today, setting countries in different circuits, if you will, or with different opportunities. And creating different predicaments for them and different opportunities. And those are all, or it's at least a large part of those are functions of the way capital markets, bonds, commercial banks, and national banks central banks are acting today across borders and through institutions like the IMF, and how the IMF is changing its own theories and structures and lending practices. All of that is part of this story. That's a very general answer, but I think the questions are so big, I mean, you guys are implicating, it seems to me, one important issue after another.
Great, thanks so much. I mean, we've been going for about 90 minutes here, so I feel like we could easily go for another 90, but I want to be kind of, mindful of people's time and keep in mind that, we really kind of could go forever. This has been kind of a wonderful discussion. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here. But thank you so much for coming, and we'll kind of continue to discuss these themes, and maybe there'll be another opportunity that we can kind of get together and kind of continue the conversation.
That would be great. And I just, as I said, I'd love to talk with each of you. It just seems to me these questions are really generative. So I'm honored. It was a real delight to be here.
Well, it was fantastic to read. It was really a treat, and it was great to be able to dig into it more with you. So thanks so much.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Thank you so much.